to the auditorium. Although this event is online, but we still welcome you come here, and because there's a coffee and we have snacks. Probably will change the snacks next week. So, so for just a brief announcement before we start the discussion today, and the next week will be the town hall meeting. So there's no real presentation. So sorry. So next week we don't have a speaker presentation, but still welcome to here to join the Dean's Town Hall in the same location here. I'm not sure. Had a collaborator, talking Grant. Sorry for that. So. Yeah, I mean, that's for next week, so welcome, and I'm sure there will be coffee next week too. So the other thing is, last week, we have the raffle, right? So we have 2 winners, and the raffles are probably who won the Starbucks card and already got the emails. And for people win last week, you still can join this week and for the next week. So keep doing that and keep coming here. And the other thing is, if you join online, and please email both your name and email to Lisa, so it make her work will be easier to write your name down and send the Starbucks card to you. That's an announcement. So for today, we have a good discussion on waste, food waste, and how did we get there. And we have 3, honors guests here. Actually, 2 speakers. I would consider Norbert, you are external speaker now. But yeah, the first speaker will Dr. Norbert Wilson. He is a director of World Food Policy Center at Duke University. Sorry, I have to change my glasses. So he is a professor of food economics and community at Duke University, Duke Divinity School, and with a joint appointment in Sanford School of Public Policy and at Duke. And Professor Wilson's research touched on several food issues such as access, choice, food waste, and domestic food system. And just I consider him an external speaker because actually before he joined the Duke University, he's my neighbor. So also here at Friedman School, he's a professor at food policy at our school. So welcome Norbert back to school. And the second speaker is Katie Marchini, and he is a chief operating officer at the non-profit food rescue organization called Replate. And at that organization, she spent her time figuring out scalable solutions for food rescue space, and she came to the Replate from catering world, and she's passionate about working at the intersection between food insecurity and climate change. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree and from Mills College, and the master degree at Food Studies from University of the Pacific. And that's 2 external speakers. We also have a moderator today. He is Corby Carman, and you probably, Corby Kammer. You probably saw him around in this building, right? So, and he is the author of The Joy of Coffee and the Pleasure of Slow Food. The first book is the English on the slow food movement, and it sounds very cool. And he has been restaurant critics of New York. I don't know if you follow him, Boston and Atlantic magazines, and food policy columnist for New York, for New Republic. He's a senior editor at the Atlantic. And there, he has long contributed articles on food and food policy, and he is editor-in-chief of Ideas, the magazine of the Aspen Institute. And every week, he's also had his commentator on food and food policy at the WGBH, Boston Public Radios. Hopefully, you will listen to that. And he has received a 5 James Beard Journalist Award. That's my long introduction. And so now is the time for I gave the floor to the speakers, and let's enjoy the talk. And I hope you will also enjoy these and ask your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to see so many former students and current students joining us by Zoom. And I wish I could see everybody in the back of Jaharis, but that's the way it always is in Jaharis. Everybody crowds at the back. And so we can barely see anybody on camera. That's the way you want it, isn't it? So we're really thrilled to have our friend and colleague Norbert, whom we refuse to think of as a former colleague because he's a current colleague and collaborator. We always try to pull him into everything we can. And in my work at Food and Society at the Aspen Institute, which is what I really do, so I'll update my bio, always trying to get him involved as a trusted guide and advisor. And Katie Marchini, delighted to meet you and to know more about Replate as we will. So I'm going to start by asking Norbert, since we're talking today about food waste, scalable solutions. Why is there so much food waste? We're all worried about this. What can we do about it? And Norbert himself has a lot of findings on research about food waste and loss from sort of early beginnings. And we'd love you to update us and tell us what your thoughts are on food waste and how we should be thinking. Thank you, Norbert.
Great. Thank you so much, Corby. And Katie, it's good to meet you as well. And hi to everyone at Tufts. It's strange to be here in Durham, but also I feel like I'm at Jaharis right now. And so thank you so much for the invitation. It's good to be back home, if you will. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about food waste. I'm on a project now, and we refer to it as wasted food, to suggest that food has value, and to say it's wasted and the way we think about it is an important part of how we address this complex problem. I got to be honest with you. I grew up probably in a time when, my parents would say, don't waste food. And the language of the Clean Plate Club, having been at Tufts, I know that language is really problematic. My mom, was doing her best to encourage me to eat the food that was on my plate. But it was an important lesson I learned early on about, again, this idea that food has value and that it's important. And also knowing that everyone doesn't have the same access to the foods that some of us have. And so being grateful and having an appreciation for what is given to us and what we're able to receive. So that was an important part of early conversations around food waste for me. It's funny how life has a way of evolving. I ended up going to a conference. It was the Ag and Human Values Conference, and I went to a session by chance. And I saw a colleague at Johns Hopkins University, Ronnie Neff, give a presentation on food waste. And she had done some survey work, and this was about 2014. And I was actually on sabbatical leave at Cornell at the time. And hearing those conversations about how consumers were wasting food, this is the first time I'd heard anyone doing academic work around wasted food. I left that conference really excited and saw that there was a real need to discuss this in some meaningful, in some other ways, in different ways. And so I was working with a colleague, Brad Rickard, and we began an experiment, a research experiment at a lab there at Cornell to see what may be contributing to food waste. And so we brought people into the lab, we exposed them to a series of products, and we used a design that different groups saw different date labels, use by, best by, sell by, to say, do those make a difference in how people waste food? Now, I've got to be honest with you, measuring food waste and trying to do that in an experimental setting is really difficult. It's not an easy thing to ask. So tell me, how much food do you waste? Many of us are going to say, no, 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 I don't really waste food. There's shame associated with it, or there's a sense that we shouldn't waste food, and so we may underreport. And to be fair, even asking in a survey, it's hard to really capture that information well. So we asked people, instead of how much food they waste or would waste for these particular products, we asked them, how much of this food do you think you'll consume? And from that, we were able to say, in percentage terms, we were able to say, well, how much they would predict, or what we term premeditated waste. And one of the things that was really striking about the findings from that work is it was consistent with some of the work that had been done at the Economic Research Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We saw somewhere around 25 to 40% of different products being wasted, or at least premeditated waste associated with different date labels. In that experiment, it's a paper published in Food Quality and Preference. It was, we discovered not only did the date label matter, but it could also matter in terms of the size of the product and the perishability of the product, and of course, the date that was listed. And so this was an important first finding for us as a group of researchers, and it's led to subsequent research papers. I gotta say, we were really excited and kind of unclear on where will this go and what is really the important factors that contribute to food waste. And so that led to a grant with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, where we did some further work on date labels and consumer perceptions about how and when and the reasons that people may waste food. And there have been some papers that have come out of that. And one of the things that, and we're still having a couple of papers that are still in process, and it's this idea that these date labels do matter. They shape preferences and perceptions of equality. And there's some other research outside of our group that has actually shown this too. There is a burgeoning body of research about the importance of those labels. Some researchers are arguing, actually, people may not even pay attention to the label. But when you are brought to the awareness of the label and what the label means, we see that there are responses. But one of the things that we have in some recent research that's not published yet, but we're in the process, is that everyone doesn't respond the same to these date labels. Okay, I know that's not 100% surprising, but sometimes research is needed to actually help us understand those things that may not necessarily be surprising. But that raises some important questions about current legislation. Pingree, Representative Pingree in the U.S. Congress has a bill to standardize date labels. Right now, there's no federal legislation that regulates these date labels. And I think it's an important step forward, but one of the things that our work is showing that we may see differential responses to even the standardization of these date labels. And so I think that's an important point for us to consider. But I just want to give you that preliminary sort of how did I get into this work? And also thank so many different people who've been a critical part of that process of learning about what food waste looks like. And I will add one more thing. I've done a lot of work on consumer side of it, but there's a whole nother side about what happens along the supply chain. And I had the opportunity to work with some great students from Tufts, actually, on a research project from USDA to actually look at case studies of lost food along the supply chain, particularly around some fruits and vegetables. So there was just a lot of work that I'd be happy to share, but I think it's time for me to pass on to the other questions.
Oh, I was carefully muted. I immediately want to ask you, what is your ideal of how people will interpret sell-by dates? But I'm going to save a follow-up so that we can hear a little more of Katie's work. Katie.
Yeah. So just to give you a little bit of background, so I work at Replate. We are a food rescue organization based out of the San Francisco Bay Area, but we've been around for about 7 years now, and we work nationally with our biggest markets being San Francisco, LA, and New York. And so we're a little different from other food recovery organizations in that we have a tech-enabled platform. So food donors are going online and scheduling a pickup. And just for some historical reference, most food rescue organizations you're still kind of having to pick up the phone and call. They're very grassroots, volunteer run, and that makes it very hard to be scalable. So we came in, we have this platform where, you know, donors can sign up, but also nonprofits can sign up to receive the food as well. And we charge donors a fee for service. So most organizations are doing this for free. We're not, because the work is not free. Even when it's free, somebody is paying for it. And a lot of that burden is on these organizations that are using volunteers. They're having to, you know, search for grants. We do too, because we're a nonprofit, even though we have an earned revenue stream. But it is quite a burden to do this work. It takes a lot of labor. It's expensive work to do. And we also don't want to incentivize people to continue having this surplus and thinking that, you know, they're just doing this amazing good thing by passing it off. And, you know, people tend to be pretty surprised that we charge a fee for service. And I think that's really funny because nobody has a problem, you know, paying someone to pick up their garbage or their recycling. Recycling also used to be a volunteer-led thing. If we just go back to like the 40s, when we were collecting tin and things for war efforts, like that is something that started out volunteer-led and then eventually moved to a paid service. I'm not saying that recycling is at all where it needs to be in this country, just to say that, you know, it is very hard to recover all of the surplus food that's in the system using volunteers. So 91 million tons of food are wasted in the US every year. Some of that isn't, you know, necessarily recoverable, but a lot of it is. And even just a fraction of that, you know, it's very challenging to recover all of that for just a bunch of volunteer organizations. We need much more collaboration in order to make that happen. But ultimately, the thing that we need the most is source reduction. So I don't know how familiar everyone is here with the EPA's food waste hierarchy. But at the very top of the hierarchy, like the best thing that we can do regarding food waste is just to not create the surplus to begin with. And then after that, it's feeding humans, which Replate is in the business of doing. Then it's feeding animals. Then it's industrial uses. So think like turning things into gas for power, and then compost, and then landfill. So compost is this thing that we generally go to as like, that's, you know, that it's amazing that we're composting, and ultimately it's just one step above landfill. That's not to say that we shouldn't be doing it, but the way that we've approached things in this country is we've kind of we're climbing up to the top instead of starting at the top and working down. And source reduction is really the thing that we want to see. We want to see donors having an understanding that they don't need to create this much surplus. As Corby had said, like I came from the catering business and I saw the premeditated waste. You know, we knew that we were going to have generally at least 20% surplus at the end of the night. And that's actually how I began working with Replate, is I wanted to be on the other side of things. I was using the service and going, this is great, because it is really challenging to donate surplus, because oftentimes people aren't thinking about their surplus food, you know, all the way up until the event. There's this concern, oh no, we're going to run out of food. We're going to run out of food. And then as soon as the event is starting, it's like, oh no, what are we going to do with all of this surplus? And there's also a tension of whose responsibility is this surplus? Is it the person who is throwing the event, or is it the caterer? There's a lot of confusion about who should be responsible. And I just also wanted to say the Norbert's work is super important in getting this food and date labeling is so important, all for many reasons, but directly related to my work. There's so much food that we receive. You know, we mostly work with prepared food because we're working with like tech companies. They're feeding their employees meals, but we also receive pantry items, and the dates on those are so confusing. And the food bank has a document about what it says on the certain type of food and what the actual true expiration, this will no longer be good to eat, could make you sick date is. And when you have to have a separate book about when things are actually going to go bad versus what the date is, like that's just, it's silly. And it also, you know, creates a lot of discomfort when food is being donated, because, you know, we want to donate with dignity. We want to make sure that people know that the food that we're bringing is like, we want it to be nutritious. We want it to be culturally acceptable and we want it to actually be utilized. And it's no good if, you know, it's going to an organization and then they're just throwing it away because they can't use it, or because, you know, they're fearful that it's out of date and then it's going to make people sick, or that, you know, people are going to be very, you know, it doesn't feel good to receive something that has a date label that's past expiration by a month, even if you know that it's good to eat. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, you know, because you both brought up sell-by dates and the confusion over them, it was my impression that various people, Norbert mentioned the woman in Maine who's a hero to all of us, who is trying very hard to streamline laws. What would your ideal be in terms of what appears as sell-by dates? And what is your impression of the legislation that's been proposed, if you happen to have been following it? Let's start with Norbert.
Sure. I am really appreciative of the efforts to try to standardize the date labels. So right now there is an industry agreement, if you will, where they are arguing for a something like a best by or a quality date label, and a use by date label. But different manufacturers, food manufacturers, they don't have to abide by an industry standard that's not required. And so folks like Emily Broad-Leib at Harvard have really argued and promoted this idea of there needs to be a sort of a federal law that states what these labels mean. And Representative Pingree's work and our colleagues who are also promoting this bill have argued a similar sort of thing. The language is a little bit different depending on than what is, I think it may be best if used by versus used by.
Exactly. It was Shelley Pingree. It was best if used by, and then she wants huge letters that say manufacturer's suggestion only.
Right. I missed that part. So thank you for that. And so I think this is a critical way of helping mitigate the challenges that these state labels present. Some of the work I've been doing, and I've got to be clear that it's not, the experimental work has not necessarily said this is going to be a label that is dictated by the federal government. However, in the work that we've done, we've seen really divergent responses to those labels. So I think they are an important first step, but it's going to be critical for consumers to really understand, and not just understand, but to actually trust what those labels ultimately mean. Yeah. It's going to take a lot of time for us to get to the new place of saying, oh, this means that this product is probably fine after this day. It just may not taste as well as it could have from what I would have imagined, right? But we also have to think about what food manufacturers are also concerned about. They don't want to necessarily have a product in the marketplace where the quality has degraded in a way that the consumer experience is poor. And so there's a real important dance around what these labels mean, and wanting to make sure manufacturers are able to keep a product to the highest quality that they think is important for consumers. But at the same time, we don't want consumers to necessarily throw away a product because they're afraid that it could make them sick at worst, or that it just may not taste as good as they would like. And so that's an important part of that. I think that is the critical part, is like, how do we help consumers get over the hump of the concerns around what the labels ultimately could mean if there is federal legislation on this, or if we just stay with the industry standards that are being promoted. So
that's great. Very helpful. Katie, could you talk about what your ideal would be also for sell-by and dates? And then I'm going to ask you something about Good Samaritan laws and how they've helped you, whether they are up to where you would like them to be.
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to date labeling, I think my ideal is, something that's unified. I'll, defer to people who are more knowledgeable about that than me. But I think the core piece of this is that if the consumers aren't educated about what those date labels mean, then it doesn't matter, right? Because people are still going to throw things out that are still good. And I think that there is a lot of education to be done. I think like even my own, partner gets really scared about milk that's like 2 days past, and it's like, I promise you, it's fine. Use your nose, trust it. Like, people are so out of touch with their own instincts around food. And I think our bodies tend to be, they've evolved to tell us, like, maybe don't eat that. And I think obviously there is something to being more, prudent when it comes to food safety. But also, if you smell your milk and it doesn't smell bad, there's nothing on it, then you can use it. Same thing with like
I can't
eggs.
resist interrupting to say my stepdaughter's refrigerator went out last night in Brooklyn, of
Yeah,
course. She was in a panic about milk and half, and I said, put it in a cooler with ice packs and open it and smell it.
exactly. Yes, yeah, 100%. It's just like, use your senses. You can trust them for the most part. I know with like more packaged things, like canned foods, it can be more scary. I think there needs to be more education of like, if there's rusty, if it seems like it's leaking, like if there's something wrong with it, yeah, then just throw it away by all means. But look at it, examine it first, and then make a decision. But generally, yeah, those states aren't not great. I know you wanted to ask about the Good Samaritan laws. Yeah, so I think the most interesting thing about being in this space is that I still regularly hear, when I tell people what I do for a living, isn't that illegal? Like, no, it's not. Wouldn't be doing it if it was, but it hasn't been illegal for a very long time. Bill Clinton signed the Good Samaritan Act federally into law in the 90s, and many states have followed suit, and they have additional protections. I think, again, there is a lack of knowledge amongst consumers about what is okay. Even when I was in the restaurant world, I wasn't clear about what food donation safe, like, is it safe, are reliable? And one of the biggest hurdles when we're working with companies is trying to get them to trust that there's not going to be liability. So for example, last year, and actually let me give some context. So California recently implemented SB 1383, which is it's a huge bill. But the part that pertains to this is that it will require food generators to donate their surplus food. So hospitals, places where they hold huge events, restaurants that are large enough, hotels, they will now be required to donate their surplus. Great news for us. And that legislation has been rolling out for the past 2 years. And in January of 2024, it'll be completely rolled out. And so everyone should be donating. But right when that legislation was being rolled out, we had a conversation with a company that is a nut company. And they had a bunch of like sample packets of nuts that they wanted to donate. Their marketing team actually was the one who got in touch with us. They're like, we have all these samples. Can you use it? And great. As long as they're still, good, yeah, happy to. And that's like an easy thing to find a home for. People want nuts. Great. And things were moving along. The pickup was scheduled, and it was, over a pallet worth of nuts. So it's like probably at least 500 pounds. I think it could have been closer to 1,000. Doesn't matter. They called that morning to cancel the pickup to say, well, our lawyers have said, no, we can't donate the food. It's too much of a liability. It's like, well, in 2 months, you're actually going to be required to donate this food. So I think it's often been used as an out for like, if you don't have to be responsible for this, it's easier to just throw it away than it is to donate it. Or that's what people think. And so it's been very challenging to get people to understand that food donation is safe and legal, and it's been happening for a very, very long time.
Can I ask you, my loyalty will always be to Community Serving. It's a wonderful organization, Boston. I hope you volunteer for, but I've also volunteered for a place called the Women's Lunch Place. I don't know if any of you students have gone, but it's a fantastic program. It's a 20-minute walk from Friedman, and it's a great place to volunteer. But once a friend of mine, while she was volunteering, brought something, and the guest looked up at my friend and said, I don't want any of your used food. And that makes me think, Katie, is there a stigma problem about donated food and by food? And how do you work to overcome that?
There definitely is. And so let me do some positioning here for myself to make it very clear that I don't think that like food donation is a very good intervention for climate change. Project Drawdown says it's like the third most impactful thing that we can do to reduce climate change. It is not a good intervention for food insecurity. Okay, it's okay for hunger, but for food insecurity, it's not, because ultimately food insecurity is a poverty problem. Like, we need poverty reduction programs to make sure that people have the resources that they need to choose what they're going to eat. I don't think that knowing that your local pantry, that you can get food there, means that you actually have a reliable source of food. You don't have the same choice as everyone else. That's not, you're still food insecure. That being said, yes, there is stigma. And I think a lot of that stigma comes from people not donating with dignity. So, you know, food needs to be prepared properly. For example, actually, there's a school district in California that we work with, and we ask for things to be packaged nicely in a way that you would want to consume it. So trays need to be closed, things need to not be leaking, things need to be as nice as possible, as if you were getting takeout. Like, it needs to be nice. And they tried to donate spaghetti in a Ziploc bag with pizza. That is unacceptable. You know, and our food rescue said, absolutely not. Like, we're not taking this. This isn't okay. Like, how dare you? Like, you're packaging this as if it's trash, and it's not okay, especially when we've offered you, you know, to find packaging for you. So I think that, yes, there is stigma, and a lot of it has come from people being really careless and thoughtless when they are donating, but also from organizations being really overwhelmed and not having enough people to help sort through donations and know, you know, be able to separate what is good from what is not. And the same thing, you know, there are a lot of donors who are donating things, and nonprofits aren't saying no because they are afraid that if they say no to this, then it means that they're never going to get another donation from that person again. And so we've tried to be the middleman of telling being the bad guys and saying, no, this isn't acceptable. It's going to make you feel good to donate this, but actually it's going to go in the trash. So we're not going to take it from you. It's useless. So there is a lot of stigma for good reason, but we work with prepared food, you know, full trays, stuff that hasn't gone out on the line. We're trying to make sure that we're donating with as much dignity as possible. And we've had very good feedback from our nonprofits, but our nonprofits, we also have a close enough relationship where if they receive something that is not up to their standards and doesn't feel good, they let us know. And so that's the most important thing, is having those clear lines of communication, because we don't want somebody to have that experience. We want them to have the experience of, this feels good, and maybe not as good as if I could go and buy this at the store, but it feels better than feeling like it's, you know, used food.
Good. Yeah, memorable phrase. Norbert, could you tell us, and everybody, questions? We've got one or two in the chat, but we'd like many more questions, because we're just about to move to questions from all of you, please. So Norbert, can you get back to the idea of what your ideal would be for sell-by dates and consumer behavior, and where you see the best solutions is coming from? You know, how can I phrase this objectively? From upstream solutions to putting all the burden on the consumer. You know, where should the responsibility lie?
Everyone's responsible. And I think this is an important point. Part of the food waste or wasted food challenge that we see is, I think a lot of us like to point at somebody else. We all have a hand in where or how food gets wasted along the supply chain. And I think we're also, we're quick to blame the consumer. And I think we know our own lives and say, oh, I'm throwing out food because I'm not being thoughtful about it, or I didn't plan. Right. So there's some definite work that we can do at the consumer side, and that's including everything that Katie was talking about, better educating the consumer, helping consumers have a better sense of the safety of food. And I want to be very clear. There are products, for example, meat products, that you really can get sick if you let it go beyond a certain point. I don't want to make it seem like everything's okay, but there are plenty of products. I mean, in some of the early work that we did, even things like breakfast cereals that were going to last for a long time, they may have been a little less crunchy afterwards, but you weren't going to get sick. And we saw people willing to throw those products out. And so there is an important place of learning of what are the parameters that are safe. So I think that's one point to consider. There is a real place for clarity on these date labels. Again, I'm in support of the legislation that's before the Congress, but I'm also cognizant that without a clear way of helping consumers understand and go about the behavior change that's needed, those labels aren't going to solve the problem alone. And so that's an important part that I don't think the legislation alone can do, but there is a place that we as people who are involved in educating others about food, as a parent, as I'm trying to raise my daughter to make good choices when it comes to food in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of what's sustainable in terms of the foods that we consume. But there are other places where we can see food loss and waste occur along the supply chain from what restaurants are doing. And so it's great to hear about the work that Katie is doing. But even all the way back to at the farm gate, and this was some of the work I did with Adriel Flanders-Sue and Laura Gallagher while at Tufts. And when we were analyzing and talking to farmers and trying to understand what happens at the farm level when food gets wasted and the challenges that farmers face, where there are quality standards that farmers have to meet. They're not throwing out product because they want to, but because the market has shifted. And so that means there is a sort of communication all along the supply chain on how to better think about what is the quality that we need and that needs to show up in the marketplace. Having more flexibility about what that product quality can be is an important one. Having a better understanding of the regulations about what those quality standards are is also important to help us navigate that. But one of the things that was interesting to learn when working with that project was that there are things like the availability of farm labor to harvest products when it's ready is not an insignificant issue. And that then moves us into a whole nother world of complex issues around policies around farm labor. And so for all that's to say, there's not a single solution that gets rid of farm food waste along the supply chain. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. And so there's some work I've done with my colleagues, Brenna Ellison and Lin Fan, who we've done some survey work trying to understand what are those food waste policies or practices that we could encourage that would allow for a reduction in food waste. And then we also asked a sort of a separate set of questions for a separate set of participants in the survey. Which policies do they think would be effective? And what was fascinating was that there's this gap, that people were really in support of things like date labeling adjustments or improving rules around food donation, even though we have things like the Emerson Good Samaritan Act. Consumers still thought that would be a really effective way of helping reduce food waste. But one of the things that we also found is that consumers, while they thought that was a great way of they thought that they were supportive of those policies, they didn't always think that they were as effective. So there's this gap between what they think they'll be in support of and what they think will be effective. One side point, which I thought was really interesting, because some municipalities have actually gone about and done this, and some nations have actually implemented policies like this, where there would be a tax on wasted food or food that would show up in the garbage. And one of the things that people were not really in favor of it, but they actually were more likely to say would be effective. So consumers aren't interested in paying more, but there is this belief that actually it would help us reduce waste because we would carry that burden. And when we think about sort of environmental economics, this idea of if I'm taking on the cost of this environmental hazard or problem, then I'm more likely to do something different. I'm incentivized to respond differently. So I would argue, yes, let's solidify and make very clear these date labels, but we need the support to help move the way people understand how to manage food. And we also need to think about the entire supply chain. One set of policies just at the consumer level is not going to solve this problem. We need a sort of a whole supply chain approach to help address this. And there are probably policies that are unrelated to food waste and loss, like immigration, or rules around farm labor that could actually help us better manage these issues. And so we don't always think about this as this complex, divergent problem, but it really does allow for us to bring different areas to help us address this issue.
Norbert, I'm going to ask you to talk about food waste every time I ask you on a panel because you're clearly so impassioned about it. This is great. And I think we'll probably have room maybe for one question, but Katie, your solutions, especially when you talked at the beginning about it's wonderful that I'm able to find ways of capturing this food, convincing people to donate it, finding ways to do it legally and practically, but it's stopping it in the first place, and it's the source control. What are your guides and tips and magic wand hopes for that?
Oh, I think just a general change in attitude from people. I think that we have such an abundance mindset in this country that things need to look abundant. For example, I was at New York Climate Week last week, and I went to a dinner hosted by the James Beard Foundation, and it was about eating for a better climate. So they're talking about things like beans and crops and what we can do to mitigate climate change from like a retail food perspective. And there was this lovely meal served. There was so much plate waste at this event. I mean, it was shocking, especially given the audience that was there and the people that were putting it on. These are educated people. They know that plate waste is a problem. They know that food waste is a problem. And yet there's this expectation, well, if people are paying for this event, then we've got to make sure that they feel like they got what they paid for. And that is it's really hard when we're serving everyone the exact same amount of food when people don't eat the same amount of food. And I think that until we get to a point where, at conferences and other things, like we have better RSVP systems, so we know how many people are actually going to attend and how many of those people that are going to attend are actually going to eat, and take into account that, if the weather is really nice, actually that means that maybe less people are going to turn up for the conference because they're going to go enjoy this new city that they're in and be outside. These things all have an impact on the amount of surplus that there is in the system. And I just think that we really have to change how we're doing events. Obviously, there are many other things that need to be changed, but I think these small things at restaurants and at home when we're serving things and making sure that we can better mitigate the amount of surplus that we're going to have, or make sure at least that it's usable surplus, right? Plate waste is not usable surplus. That's either going to go to industrial sources or it's going to go to compost or maybe landfill, depending on where you are. So at least making sure that, things are held back in the kitchen and people can ask for seconds if they want more, rather than giving them this huge portion that they're not going to eat. And I think it also goes for consumers of being, I don't want to place blame, like I feel like consumers always get, all this blame in this capitalist system, but also food waste is the one thing where, 48% of food that's wasted is at the consumer level. And so this is an area that, there's so many things going wrong in this world that it feels like we have no control over. This thing in your daily life, you do have some control over, and not being afraid to be the person at the restaurant who says, maybe we shouldn't order that additional dish and we can order it if we still want more afterwards. Or doing the thing that I am always embarrassed that I do, but I think is like helpful, is telling the person, when I'm getting, like I went to an ice cream place last night and it was like soft serve and I saw how big it was. I'd already eaten a big dinner. I wanted dessert still. There's no way I'm going to finish this. And I said, hey, can you give me half the amount? I'll pay the same amount, but like, can you just reduce the amount by half? And usually I've never had someone say no, right? I'm going to still pay the same amount, but I don't want the guilt of throwing this thing away. And I also know that it has an impact when I throw this thing away, rather than having the awkward interaction of asking for less. So that's more of a
ice cream scoopers level off the top of the cup and go a little low. They really are puzzled by this. And I say, no, I'll keep paying the same thing. Can we go back to the UN conference and the irony of ridiculous platters of food?
Yeah.
that nobody will eat. So what is in order? A public shaming, and you're saying, who do you think you are calling for climate change and help? Do you want, do you call it out in front of the room? Seriously, because we all encounter this. And also, what about your work as a caterer? How
Yeah.
should caterers be working with their clients? And what should clients be thinking of asking for caterers in case
Yeah.
many people on this call and on this Zoom are going to be organizing events of their own, if not now, in the next few years?
Yeah. So, well, they're going to be getting a mild mannered email from me about it. But I think the thing is setting up expectations, right? I think at that event, they could have very easily said, hey, we know that the portions are going to be a little small. If you're hungry, feel free to like grab your waiter. They'll bring you more if you want it. But we know that plate waste is a huge problem. We're going to reduce it. So I think it's saying at the start to everyone at the event, coming from the event host, here's what we're trying to do. So then everyone has an understanding. It's like, oh, they're not trying to like, swindle me. There is a real reason that they're giving me less food at this. From a catering perspective, there's two things. One, there's almost always some surplus. So have a plan for what you're going to do with that surplus. Try to work with an organization to get it donated. But before that, try to get an RSVP list, try to understand what the true attendance is going to be. Work with when you're having events, if you can work with the same caterer year over year, that also really helps because or at least get the numbers from the caterer of how much was left over and how many people were in attendance. Because over time, you can really get things to a point where you understand your numbers and you're not going to have the same surplus that you did in year 1, in year 3, even if the conference is continuing to grow. And I think also believing your caterer when your caterer says, hey, actually in San Francisco, when we have events and we serve beans, nobody eats it. We can have them, but maybe do 80% less than you think, because it's going to be surplus at the end of the night. So I think having those conversations, but also telling your caterer, if we run out of food, it's okay. Right? Because that's the biggest thing. People are very afraid of running out of food at an event. And it's seen as a sign of failure if you run out of food versus a sign of success. And I think that needs to shift, but that does have to come from the person spending the money saying it's okay.
This is so depressing to hear you say that nobody will eat beans, because we spend our lives telling people to eat beans.
In San Francisco, at least, when I was doing events.
Yeah, but it's San Francisco, capital of enlightenment, capital of virtue signaling, and they eat some beans. This is very depressing. It reminds me to ask Norbert about behavioral nudges, which beloved to we in NICBIC, behavioral modification. So you've worked in behavioral nudges, and do you have any solutions to getting people to eat more beans, or do you think that there are certain times to target these messages that are the most effective?
Wow, Corby, that's really an interesting question. And I don't have research that points to that specifically, but it does make me think about ways that we could actually talk about this. And so I've been working on this one project that looked at sort of risk preferences, thinking about I was worried or concerned that people who are really risk averse were more likely to say, I don't want to take the risk of eating an unhealthy product. And dealing with that wasn't the real issue. It was more that people who are using terminology of loss averse, people who are afraid of these negative outcomes as opposed to maybe potentially good outcomes, were the ones who are more likely to waste the product relative to those who were not as loss averse. And so again, this hasn't been published, but it's an important finding that I hope we are able to get out one day, and to be able to establish that there are these differences in kind of characteristics of folks that may lead them to waste more food than others. So when we're thinking about implementing policy, such as state labels or other policies, we may want to think about that there are certain groups to target with interventions more so than others because they're more receptive or are more likely to waste product than others. And so I think that's an important part of it. It was interesting, this idea of avoiding, Katie was talking about this idea of we want to see abundance. And I was doing some work in a slightly different space, but this idea of how do you discourage people from actually picking up sort of less healthy products. And one of the things that we saw is make it look less available than other products, but that also has the tendency to help people potentially avoid picking up that product, which they may waste. So if it's not in super abundance, those people who want it are going to get it. They're not just going to get it because it's available. We tend not to want to look like we're greedy, and we want to make sure that others who may want that product can have access to it. So for all those reasons, I think as we're thinking about how to avoid waste, Katie has already hit on this. If you know that people aren't interested in a particular product, make sure it's not there in abundance. Make sure it's available for those who are more likely to eat it in a smaller quantity, and you may actually encourage a real good consumption of a product. I was at an event, the European Agricultural Economics Association, and they were very clear they were trying to avoid food waste. And one of the things they did a couple of days before the event is they send out an announcement and say, tell us which of these events you think you'll probably attend and which are meal events. So they were trying to get as close as possible to the event, whether or not we were actually going to participate. So that kind of thing actually even made me not only say whether or not I was going to attend the event, but it also made me realize they're thinking about this. I don't have evidence to say that it solved the problem of excessive plate waste, but it made me aware that they were concerned about this. And knowing that that was a concern actually helps me think to be more careful, makes me think to be more careful about what I'm consuming. And so I appreciate the little ways that we may be influencing behavior, but I just encourage, there's a body of work to be done there. And so thanks, Corby, for seeding that thought.
And N of one, depressing one person's anecdote. I helped organize food for my college reunion because, of course, what else was I capable of doing except setting the menus? And I insisted on family style so that there would be less food shipped back to the kitchen on those absurd plated, bad, depressing looking plates that are served. And I got so many complaints from classmates that they didn't get enough food. And so, Katie, I hate all of your wonderful prompts.
Yeah.
And these are enlightened people who are supposed to be against food waste. I wanted to ask you, Katie, since you're in the capital of enlightenment, San Francisco, or have been there, compost laws. And do you think that they really help people reduce waste? And I believe that Boston is phasing in mandated compost as well. And it's been the rule of the city for a long time in San Francisco, hasn't it? And do you see it as having changed consumption and waste in San Francisco?
Oh, that's a complicated one. So I would say that I think, that having a composting program is important because the same apple going to compost versus going to landfill has a different impact. So it's going to release more methane in landfill than in composting where it's going to be sequestered. So I think that it's needed for that. There needs to be a way to manage it. I think that it's complicated because in some ways it has changed things, right? When I come to a city like New York, I'm shocked by how many plastic water bottles people are carrying and how, there's just, all of the paper products that you receive for takeout from a restaurant in San Francisco, most of the products are compostable. And you will receive, there's question about how compostable some of these compostable products are and what the environmental impact, but I still think generally better than styrofoam. So I think it's interesting seeing not necessarily like the produce and the things that you typically would see as composted, but more so the consumer waste that's associated with takeout and other things that is going in landfill in certain places because there isn't a compostable option versus in San Francisco, you have a compostable takeout option. So your coffee cup or your utensils are like, they're going to be compostable. At most events that you go to, there is compostable plates and other things. So I think that there is more openness to it, but I think like the composting laws in California, you know, my parents live in Stockton, and composting there, like the education just isn't quite there yet. I was getting really frustrated because composting, it varies from municipality what you can actually compost, but there were certain things that she wasn't composting that I was like, this very clearly is something that's composted in all municipalities. There shouldn't be a problem with this. And she was saying, yeah, but I'm afraid that the garbage guy, when he sees it, they're like fining people for things being in the compost that aren't supposed to be in it. And I'm just afraid that he's not even going to know that like this is actually compostable. So it's complex. Like, I think that there should be composting, but I don't think it's the like silver bullet solution that we all make it out to be. Sorry, that was a little long-winded answer for a.
Not at all. I think I'm going to ask you for any concluding remarks, but one more concluding piece of advice for the audience is, you know, as soon as you talk about what's compostable, what's not, it's so confusing and upsetting. And my stepdaughter in Brooklyn will severely upbraid me for not putting the right thing in. And of course, it's transparent and there will be fines. And it is it's like a code of law that you do have to learn. So I think that Kriti might be asking the same question, which is advice for students and general consumers at the market. Because I think that what we buy and when we buy it in the first place has such an impact on what we end up using and wasting. So Norbert, feel free to give us some of the advice you are giving your daughter, and hard-won advice from Katie, please.
Well, I appreciate this, and I'm sure my daughter, if she knew I was referring to her, would be cringing as I'm speaking. So with that said, you know, the thing that I've learned, I'll start off in a broader research question, and then I'll talk about sort of steps forward. And I'll say the work that I've been doing, I'm working with a group of researchers on a National Science Foundation project called Recipes. That's looking at food waste and looking at it in terms of convergent research. Like, what does it mean for these different researchers to come together to try to address this really complex problem of food waste or wasted food? And so one of the things I've learned out of this is it's going to take a lot of different people to help us address this problem, to reduce wasted food. And it's going to take behavior change. It's going to take policy change. It's going to take changes in the way we process foods and engineer foods, and the way we even manage our waste. So I think it's important that it's going to require all hands on deck to address this problem, because it has significant implications when we talk about climate. There are implications when we talk about food access, and even the price of food. So I would argue all of those things are important. One of the things I think is critical, we need to do at least two things. One, really become better acquainted with food. I'm so grateful for my time at Friedman. I was learning to cook. I've been learning to cook, and I've just learned to appreciate the food that we have available to us. Two, also resetting our expectations about food. Not that we should eat something that's going to ever make us sick. I'm not encouraging that. But I think sometimes our conceptions of what is quality is a little too restrictive. And there's great food that may not look the way we want, or may appear in a slightly different form, but we've got to learn how to use what's available to us. I hate to say this, but I think we have a sense of abundance that makes it's easy to say, I don't like it that way. Let's reset our expectations. I realize we're near time, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, just some quick remarks. One, get really familiar with using your freezer, especially for the students out there. When you have surplus that you're not going to eat, your freezer can come in handy. And two, there's a book by a chef, Tamar Adler, An Everlasting Meal Cookbook. And that cookbook, I think, needs to be reading for anyone that cares about food waste and who is learning to cook, it'll teach you how to use the things that you don't know how to use. And I think that that is just so important. And when it comes to buying, like trying to be more cost effective by buying things that are in larger packaging, try to see if you can go in on it with your friends. I know obviously like that creates more work, but having people over for dinner, doing the things that can utilize that food and make sure that it doesn't go to waste. And you know, when you don't like something, something's not up to your quality standard. I got apricots that had pit burn because of climate change. And instead of eating them out of hand like I wanted to, I cooked them down into jam. It took like 5 minutes. Like it really not 5 minutes. It took 10 to 15 minutes, but it was great. And like then they got eaten. So trying to think of things as precious and trying to think about the resources that went into it. So that way you feel connected to it and inclined to use it and give it its highest purpose.
Wonderful. We are at time, but I'm so glad you mentioned Tamara Adler, who's a beautiful writer. And she has a new Substack newsletter, The Kitchen Shrink is In. But she wrote An Everlasting Meal and a follow-up cookbook to that. She's just wonderful. And Boston's very own May Lee has Margaret Lee, known as May, has just written a book called Perfectly Good Food, very similar. She came and she talked to our Friedman class just last week. So we recommend that. We thank our wonderful panelists, Katie and Norbert, for a great discussion, and thank everyone very much for coming.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much, Norbert and Katie and Corby. Thank you so much. And just remember, next week we will have a town hall meeting here. Came here, and after that we will have another like a postal landing talk, and after the town